June 6th, 1944, the Normandy coast of France. At exactly 7:35 in the morning, 21,400 Canadian soldiers faced a stretch of beach that would either make them heroes or statistics. The water was cold and gray. The sound of explosions rolled across the waves like thunder that would not stop. Above them, German machine guns sat in concrete bunkers waiting. Below them, mines hidden in the sand waited too. This beach had a name, Juno Beach, and right now, 14,000 German defenders were pointing their weapons directly at the Canadians coming ashore. This is the story of why Canadian soldiers earned the nickname the Quiet Professionals, and you are about to see exactly why they deserved it. The numbers told a grim story before a single shot was fired. Military planners in London had studied this beach for months. They knew it was the second most heavily defended landing zone in all of Normandy. Only Omaha Beach, where the Americans would land, had more guns, more bunkers, and more ways to kill you. The Canadian commanders looked at their maps and did the math. If things went according to the usual rules of war, 800 Canadian boys would die on this beach before lunch, maybe more. The British generals who planned the invasion gave the Canadians their assignment with quiet doubt in their eyes. Sure, Canada was sending troops, but were they really ready for this? In the British command tents, whispers spread like smoke. Canada had been training its army for only 5 years. 5 years. Britain had centuries of military tradition, famous regiments with battle honors going back hundreds of years. America had proven itself in North Africa and Italy. But Canada, they were the backup plan, the Commonwealth country that sent what it could. The generals were polite about it, of course. They used careful words. One British commander wrote in his notes that the Canadian leadership was adequate but unproven. Another said the troops seemed eager but lacked the killer instinct that came from generations of warrior culture. The Canadians were farmers and factory workers, lumberjacks and shopkeepers. What did they know about real war? Major General Rod Keller stood on the deck of a ship that morning, watching his men prepare to climb down into the landing craft. He was 47 years old. His face showed the lines of a man who had already seen one world war. Back in 1918, Keller had fought in the trenches of France as a young man. He knew what German bullets felt like when they snapped past your head. He knew the smell of mud mixed with blood. Now, 26 years later, he was back in France leading the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division into the largest invasion in human history. The British High Command had given him this job without much fanfare. No speeches about his brilliance, no predictions of glory. Just orders and a beach that might swallow his entire division whole. Keller watched his men and saw something the British generals did not see. These were not men who dreamed of medals. They did not march with bands playing behind them, thinking about parades back home. They were quiet, focused. They checked their weapons with the same care a carpenter checks his tools before building a house. They helped each other with their packs without being told. When they spoke, their words were few. There was no boasting, no wild promises about what they would do to the enemy. Just men preparing to do a job that needed doing. The British officers had their doubts, but Keller had watched these soldiers train. He had seen them in exercises that pushed them harder than the standard British program. While British troops trained for 12 weeks, the Canadians at Camp Borden trained for 16. 4 extra weeks of learning how to shoot straighter, move faster, and think clearer under pressure. But it was not just about time, it was about what they learned. British doctrine said that corporals followed orders from lieutenants. Lieutenants followed orders from captains. Everyone stayed in their lane. The Canadian training was different. They taught their corporals to think like officers. When the lieutenant fell, the corporal had to be ready to make the hard choices. When things went wrong, and things always went wrong in battle, every Canadian soldier needed to know not just what to do, but why they were doing it. The conventional wisdom said this approach would create chaos. Soldiers needed strict control, the experts insisted. Give them too much freedom, and they would panic when the plan fell apart. But Keller had seen something else in the training grounds. He had seen young men from small towns in Saskatchewan and fishing villages in Nova Scotia learn to solve problems on their own. They did not need someone shouting orders every second. They figured things out. They adapted, and they did it all without drama, without fuss, without needing to be the center of attention. As the landing craft began to load, Keller thought about a conversation he had with a British colonel the week before. The colonel had been polite but pointed. He asked if the Canadians were truly ready for the intensity of a contested beach landing. After all, they had not faced anything like this before. Keller had looked at the man for a long moment before answering. His words were simple, and they would prove to be the most important insight of the entire campaign. Canadians don't fight for glory, Keller said quietly. They fight to finish the job and go home. The colonel had nodded politely, but his eyes showed he did not really understand. How could that mindset possibly be enough against 14,000 entrenched German soldiers with orders to throw the invasion back into the sea? The engines of the landing craft roared to life, the smell of diesel fuel mixed with salt water. Young men who had never seen combat gripped their rifles and thought about the farms and cities they came from. They were about to find out if being quiet professionals meant anything at all when the bullets started flying. But to understand what happened next, we need to go back and see where this quiet professionalism came from. The Canadian approach to war did not happen by accident. It was built deliberately over years of training that looked nothing like what other armies were doing. At Camp Borden in Ontario, Canadian recruits arrived expecting the usual military routine. Instead, they found something different. While British training camps ran their programs for 12 weeks, Camp Borden ran for 16. Those extra 4 weeks were not just about doing more push-ups or marching longer distances. They were about learning to think. The training officers at Camp Borden had a radical idea. They believed that in the chaos of real combat, the soldier who could think for himself would live longer and fight better than the soldier who just followed orders. So they taught corporals, the lowest level of leadership, how to make decisions that most armies reserved for lieutenants. They ran exercises where they would suddenly remove the officer in charge and see what happened. Could the corporal step up? Could he read the battlefield and figure out what needed to happen next? In most armies, when the officer fell, the squad stopped working. At Camp Borden, when the officer fell, the corporal took over without missing a beat. This was precision training, not heroics training. The Canadians did not practice dramatic bayonet charges or learn inspiring speeches. They practiced reading maps in the rain. They practiced fixing broken radios under pressure. They practiced moving from one position to another without wasting time or exposing themselves to enemy fire. It was boring to watch. It did not look impressive, but it worked. The first real test came in August of 1918, and it was a disaster. The Canadian military sent 5,000 troops on a raid against the French port of Dieppe. The plan was to hit the Germans hard, grab what intelligence they could, and get out fast. It went wrong almost immediately. German guns tore into the landing craft before they even reached the beach. Canadian soldiers ran onto the rocks and found themselves trapped. The tanks could not climb over the seawall. The radios did not work. Confusion spread like poison. By the end of that terrible day, 68% of the Canadian raiders were dead, wounded, or captured. It was one of the bloodiest failures of the entire war. British commanders looked at Dieppe and saw their doubts confirmed. The Canadians were brave, sure, but bravery was not enough. They lacked experience. They lacked the polish of a truly professional army. Some British officers quietly suggested that Canada should stick to supporting roles, leave the hard fighting to those who knew what they were doing. The Canadian farm boy tactics, as one British general called them, were too naive for modern warfare. But the Canadians did not see Dieppe the same way. They saw lessons, hard, bloody lessons, but lessons all the same. They studied what went wrong. The radios failed because they got wet in the landing craft, so they designed better waterproof cases. The tanks could not move on the rocks, so they figured out which beaches had sand instead. The coordination between Navy, Air Force, and ground troops broke down, so they practiced working together over and over until it became second nature. Dieppe hurt, but the Canadians were determined to make sure those 400 casualties taught them something valuable. One man watched the Canadians learning from their mistakes and paid attention. General Bernard Montgomery was not easy to impress. He had commanded armies in North Africa and seen every kind of soldier the British Empire could produce. In the summer of 1943, he traveled to Sicily to observe training exercises before the invasion of Italy. The Canadians were there, preparing for their first major campaign since Dieppe. Montgomery stood in the hot sun and watched them work. What he saw surprised him. The Canadian units moved with a kind of quiet efficiency that reminded him of a well-run factory. No wasted motion, no showing off. When something went wrong in the exercise, the junior officers and even the corporals adjusted without waiting for new orders from above. They were not flashy, but they were reliable. Montgomery made a note in his journal that night. He wrote that the Canadians had something many veteran units lacked. They had discipline without rigidity. They could follow a plan, but they could also think when the plan fell apart. A few weeks later, Montgomery gave the Canadians a difficult assignment in the real invasion of Sicily. He wanted to see if what he observed in training would hold up under fire. July 1943. The mountains of Sicily rose like walls of rock under the summer sun. The Germans had picked their defensive positions carefully. They held the high ground with clear views of every approach. Military textbooks said attacking through mountains was slow, bloody work. You could expect to advance maybe 10 or 12 kilometers in 2 days if you were lucky and willing to pay the price in casualties. Montgomery gave the Canadians their sector and wondered how long it would take them to push through. 48 hours later, the Canadians had advanced 24 kilometers, double what anyone expected. They moved through terrain that should have stopped them cold, and they did it without taking catastrophic losses. How? They used what they learned at Camp Borden. When they hit a German position that was too strong to attack head-on, they did not wait for orders. The corporals and sergeants looked at their maps, found another route, and flanked around. When their tanks could not climb a certain slope, the infantry went ahead, cleared the position, and called the tanks up a different way. They solved problems as they found them, and they kept moving. The British officers who had dismissed Canadian methods began to pay attention. Maybe there was something to this approach after all. Maybe letting soldiers think for themselves was not chaos. Maybe it was the future. The Canadians were working with equipment that was often older and less impressive than what the British or Americans carried. Their tanks were not the newest models, their radios were not the most advanced, but they took care of what they had. Canadian mechanics became famous for keeping vehicles running long after they should have broken down. They improvised parts when spare parts ran out. They treated their weapons like precious tools because they knew their lives depended on them working when it mattered most. By the end of the Sicily campaign, something had shifted in how the Allied command saw the Canadians. They were no longer the backup troops. They were becoming the reliable professionals you called when you had a hard job that absolutely needed to get done. Montgomery himself began requesting Canadian units for difficult operations. He knew they would not make excuses. They would not need constant supervision. They would figure it out and get it done. Word spread through the Allied armies. If you wanted drama and glory, look elsewhere. But if you wanted the job finished, call the Canadians. And now, less than a year later, they would face their biggest test yet. Back on Juno Beach, the moment of truth arrived. The ramps of the landing craft dropped at 7:49 in the morning on June 6, 1944. Cold seawater rushed in, soaking the Canadian soldiers up to their waists. The crack of German 88mm guns echoed across Juno Beach like giant snapping wooden boards. The air smelled of salt and explosives, a sharp chemical tang that burned in the nose. Bullets hit the water around the landing craft, making strange zipping sounds as they passed. Some men never made it off the ramp, but the ones who did started moving forward with a kind of grim determination that surprised even themselves. Canadian engineers ran onto the beach while machine gun fire kicked up sand around their boots. Their job was to clear the metal obstacles that the Germans had planted in the surf to rip apart landing craft. These obstacles had mines attached to them. One wrong move and you were gone. But the engineers worked methodically, cutting wires and marking safe paths, even as bullets cracked overhead. There were no battle cries, no dramatic speeches, just men doing their jobs with the kind of focus you might see in someone building a barn. Except, if you made a mistake building a barn, the barn fell down. Here, if you made a mistake, you and 10 other men died. Behind them, infantry soldiers moved up the beach in small groups. They used the training from Camp Borden without thinking about it now. When one group got pinned down by machine gun fire, another group flanked around to take out the German position. When a lieutenant fell wounded, the corporal took over and kept the squad moving. There was controlled aggression in every movement, but no chaos. The Canadians advanced like a machine that had been well built and well maintained. By noon, something remarkable had happened. The Canadian forces had pushed 10 kilometers inland from Juno Beach. 10 kilometers. That was further than any other Allied unit on D-Day. The Americans at Omaha Beach were still fighting to get off the sand. The British at Gold and Sword had made progress, but nothing like this. And the butcher's bill, as soldiers called the casualty count, was lower than anyone had predicted. The planners in London had expected 800 Canadian dead by the end of the day. The actual number was 340. Each one of those deaths was a tragedy. A young life ended on a beach, far from home. But it was less than half of what the experts said would happen. The Canadians had done the impossible. They broke through the second most heavily defended beach in Normandy and kept going. Compare this to what happened at Omaha Beach. The American 1st Infantry Division was attacking there, and these were experienced soldiers who had fought in North Africa. They were good troops, battle-tested and brave. But Omaha Beach chewed them up. By the end of D-Day, 2,400 American soldiers were dead or wounded at Omaha. The beach was more heavily defended than Juno, true, but not by much. And the Americans had more firepower, more naval support, more of everything. Yet the Canadians at Juno, with less experience and older equipment, suffered 1,074 casualties total and achieved more territorial gains. The difference was not in courage. American soldiers were just as brave. The difference was in training and approach. The Canadians had learned to think and adapt. When the plan broke down, they made a new plan on the spot. Word of the Canadian success spread fast through the Allied command. By August of 1944, Just 2 months later, there were 175,000 Canadian troops in northwest Europe. They had become the go-to force for difficult assignments. When a position needed to be taken, and taken quickly, commanders asked for the Canadians. They were not the biggest army in Europe. The Americans and British had far more troops, but size is not everything. What mattered was reliability. The Germans noticed too. In their headquarters, German officers studied maps showing where different Allied units were positioned. They marked the Canadian sectors with special attention. Intelligence reports from captured German documents showed that they had given the Canadians a nickname. They called them Blutnase. It meant bloody noses in German. It was the highest threat assessment you could get. The Germans respected the Americans and British, but they feared the Canadians. There was something relentless about them. They did not stop. They did not slow down. They just kept coming, solving problems, adapting, moving forward. German commanders tried different approaches to stop the Canadian advance. They pulled in reserve units, elite troops who were supposed to be held back for emergencies. They fortified positions that should have been nearly impossible to attack. They used every trick they knew. But the Canadians kept finding ways through. It was like watching water find cracks in a dam. You could block one path, and they would find another. You could set up a perfect ambush, and somehow they would sense it and go around. The German approach relied on rigid defensive positions and strict adherence to plans. The Canadian approach relied on flexible thinking and initiative at every level. In that matchup, flexibility won. In October of 1944, the Allied command faced a problem. The Netherlands was still under German occupation. Millions of Dutch civilians were suffering under Nazi rule, and as winter approached, they were beginning to starve. The Germans had flooded parts of the country, destroyed crops, and taken most of the food for themselves. Someone needed to liberate the Netherlands, and it would not be easy. The Germans were dug in deep. The terrain was terrible for attackers, full of canals and flooded fields. It would take months of hard fighting through cold, wet conditions. The commanders looked at their options and made a decision. They gave the job to the Canadians. This was not what anyone expected when the war started. The liberation of the Netherlands became the largest sustained Canadian military operation of the entire war. From October 1944 through May 1945, Canadian forces fought through some of the worst conditions imaginable. The winter was brutal. Rain turned the ground to mud. Ice formed on weapons. Soldiers stood guard in frozen water and up to their knees. The Germans fought for every town, every bridge, every kilometer. But the Canadians kept pushing. Town by town, field by field, they drove the Germans back. The scale of what the Canadians accomplished in those months is hard to grasp. They cleared more than 500 kilometers of occupied territory. They liberated 22 million European civilians from Nazi control. When Canadian soldiers entered Dutch towns, people came out of their houses crying with joy. Old women kissed the soldiers. Children ran alongside the tanks. The Dutch had been under German rule for 5 years, and now these quiet soldiers from across the ocean had come to set them free. The Canadians did not boast about it. They did not demand parades or medals. They just did the job they were sent to do. The sound of boot steps on cobblestone streets as Canadian infantry entered liberated towns. The smell of diesel from the tanks mixing with the scent of tulip fields that had somehow survived the war. The sight of Dutch flags hidden away for years, suddenly appearing in windows as the Germans retreated. The feel of cold rain running down the back of your neck as you dug a foxhole in the mud, knowing you had to hold this position because people were counting on you. These were the details that the soldiers remembered for the rest of their lives. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the Canadians had established something that could not be argued with anymore. They were not backup troops. They were not inexperienced farm boys. They were professionals who got the job done without flash or drama. The approach that British commanders once dismissed as naive had proven itself in the hardest test possible. Real combat against a skilled enemy over months and years. And the Canadians had won, not through overwhelming force or superior equipment, but through training, discipline, and the ability to think clearly when everything around you was chaos. When the guns finally went quiet in May of 1945, something interesting happened to the Canadian military approach. Most armies went back to doing things the old way. The war was over, so why change? But the lessons the Canadians had learned about decentralized command and quiet professionalism did not disappear. Instead, they grew into something bigger. They became the foundation for a completely new way of thinking about how soldiers should operate in the world. The real test came in 1956, 11 years after the war ended. Egypt and Israel were on the edge of a full-scale war over the Suez Canal. Britain and France had jumped in on Israel's side, and suddenly the whole Middle East was about to explode into a conflict that could pull in the Soviet Union and the United States. The world needed someone to step between the armies and keep the peace. But who could do that? You needed soldiers who were disciplined enough to follow strict rules of engagement, smart enough to make decisions without constant supervision, and calm enough not to escalate situations into firefights. You needed soldiers who knew how to be professionals without needing to prove how tough they were. A Canadian diplomat named Lester Pearson had an idea. He proposed sending a United Nations peacekeeping force to Egypt, and he suggested that Canadian soldiers should form the core of this force. Other countries thought he was crazy at first. Sending armed soldiers to keep peace sounded like a contradiction. But Pearson understood something important. The Canadian approach to warfare, the same approach that won at Juno Beach and liberated the Netherlands, was perfect for this new kind of mission. Canadian soldiers knew how to stay calm under pressure. They knew how to think for themselves when situations changed. Most importantly, they knew how to get a job done without making it about themselves. The first UN peacekeeping mission worked. Canadian soldiers stood between Egyptian and Israeli forces, and instead of fighting, they watched and waited, and kept both sides from starting something that could not be stopped. It was boring work most of the time. Standing at checkpoints in the desert heat, patrolling empty roads, writing reports. There were no heroic charges, no dramatic battles, just professionals doing a job that needed doing. And it worked so well that it became the model for peacekeeping missions all over the world. Canada would go on to participate in almost every major UN peacekeeping operation for the next 50 years. The quiet professionals had found their calling in the post-war world. Military academies around the globe started studying what the Canadians had done in World War II and afterward. At first, they looked at the battles, the tactics, the specific decisions that led to victory. But the more they studied, the more they realized the real innovation was not in any single tactic. It was in the philosophy. The idea that you could train soldiers to think for themselves, that you could trust junior leaders to make important decisions, that discipline did not have to mean blind obedience. This was revolutionary stuff, and it slowly changed how modern militaries trained their troops. Special forces units paid particularly close attention. The British SAS, the American Green Berets, elite units from a dozen countries, they all started incorporating elements of the Canadian approach into their training. They taught their operators to be self-reliant, to think creatively under pressure, to complete the mission without needing constant guidance from above. The Canadian emphasis on quiet competence became the gold standard for professional soldiers worldwide. It turned out that the boring virtues of discipline, thorough training, and personal responsibility were more effective than dramatic heroics and rigid command structures. Major General Rod Keller did not live to see most of this evolution. In August of 1944, just 2 months after D-Day, he was badly wounded during the battle for Falaise. A German shell exploded near his command post, and shrapnel tore through his body. He survived, but his war was over. The British command awarded him the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership during the Normandy campaign. It was a significant honor, one that recognized his role in the successful invasion. But Keller did not make a big show of it. In 1945, as the war ended, he quietly returned to civilian life in Canada. No book deals, no lecture tours, no attempts to cash in on his fame. He had done his job, and now it was time to go home and live a normal life. He died in 1954 at the age of 57, and most Canadians had already forgotten his name. That was somehow fitting. The man who led the quiet professionals was himself a quiet professional. The soldiers who served under Keller carried the lessons forward, though. They came home to Canada, and many of them stayed in the military or joined the reserves. They taught the next generation of soldiers the same principles they had learned. When you give people proper training and trust them to do their jobs, they rise to the occasion. When you emphasize competence over glory, you build something that lasts. These were not flashy ideas. They did not make for exciting recruitment posters, but they worked. In 1993, Canada created a new Special Forces unit called Joint Task Force 2, known simply as JTF-2. The government designed it to handle counterterrorism, hostage rescue, and other high-risk operations. From the beginning, JTF-2 embraced the quiet professional ethos that came from World War II. They operated in secret. They did not talk to the press. They did not brag about their missions. When they succeeded, which was most of the time, you only found out about it years later, if at all. Other special forces units around the world began to recognize JTF-2 as one of the most effective organizations in the business. American and British Special Forces operators, in rare moments of candor, would tell you that working with JTF-2 was a privilege. The Canadians showed up, did exceptional work, and never tried to steal the spotlight. The tradition continued. What does all of this teach us? On the surface, this is a story about military tactics and battlefield success, but look deeper and it becomes a story about human nature and how we think about excellence. We live in a world that loves flash and drama. We celebrate the loud, the bold, the people who demand attention. Social media rewards those who shout the loudest. Business culture often promotes those who take credit most aggressively. We are trained to think that if you are not making noise, you must not be doing anything important. The Canadians proved the opposite. They showed that real effectiveness often looks boring from the outside. The most dangerous soldiers on D-Day were not the ones giving inspiring speeches or seeking glory. They were the ones who had trained thoroughly, thought clearly, and focused on completing the mission. The most innovative military approach of World War II was not some dramatic new weapon or bold strategy. It was the simple idea that you should train people to think for themselves and trust them to do so. This matters beyond the battlefield. In any field, the people who actually get important things done are often not the ones making the most noise about it. The best teachers are usually not the ones constantly talking about how great they are at teaching. The best doctors are usually not the ones seeking fame. The best leaders in any organization are often the ones who focus on the work itself, rather than on making sure everyone knows how important they are. Quiet competence beats loud incompetence every single time. But our culture does not always recognize that until the results become undeniable. The Canadian soldiers of World War II faced skepticism and doubt from people who should have known better. British generals dismissed them as inexperienced farm boys. German intelligence underestimated them at first, but the Canadians did not waste energy arguing or trying to prove themselves with words. They simply did the work. They trained harder. They thought more clearly. They adapted faster. And when the test came, when thousands of lives hung in the balance on beaches and in frozen fields, they delivered results that spoke louder than any boast ever could. History is full of heroes seeking glory and finding death instead. The story of the quiet professionals reminds us that sometimes the deadliest warriors, the most effective people in any field, are the ones who simply show up, do the job, and let their results speak for themselves. In a world that constantly demands we promote ourselves and seek attention, there is something deeply powerful about people who just focus on being excellent at what they do. The Canadians did not need the spotlight. They had something better. They had competence, discipline, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are prepared for whatever comes next. And in the end, that proved to be enough.